in the Western Hemisphere who live under brutal oppression.
Listen to this.
Such as those in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. According to a recent report from the UN Human Rights Council, women in Venezuela stand in line for 10 hours a day waiting for food. Over 15,000 people have been detained as political prisoners. Modern-day death squads are carrying out thousands of extrajudicial killings. The dictator Maduro is a Cuban puppet, protected by Cuban bodyguards, hiding from his own people, while Cuba plunders Venezuela's oil wealth to sustain its own corrupt communist rule. Since I last spoke in this hall, the United States and our partners have built a historic coalition of 55 countries that recognize the legitimate government of Venezuela. To the Venezuelans trapped in this nightmare, please know that all of America is united behind you. The United States has vast quantities of humanitarian aid ready and waiting to be delivered. We're watching the Venezuela situation very closely. We await the day when democracy will be restored, when Venezuela will be free, and when liberty will prevail throughout this hemisphere. One of the most serious challenges our countries face is the specter of socialism. It's the wrecker of nations and destroyer of societies. Events in Venezuela remind us all that socialism and communism are not about justice. They are not about equality. They are not about lifting up the poor. And they are certainly not about good of the nation. Socialism and communism are about one thing only: power for the ruling class. Today I repeat a message for the world that I have delivered at home. America will never be a socialist country. In the last century, socialism and communism killed 100 million people. Sadly, as we see in Venezuela, the death toll continues in this country. These totalitarian ideologies, combined with modern technology, have the power to excise new and disturbing forms of suppression and domination. For this reason, the United States is taking steps to better screen foreign technology and investments and to protect our data and our security. We urge every nation present to do the same. Freedom and democracy must be constantly guarded and protected, both abroad and from within. We must always be skeptical of those who want conformity and control. Even in free nations, we see alarming signs and new challenges to liberty. A small number of social media platforms are acquiring immense power over what we can see and over what we are allowed to say. A permanent political class is openly disdainful, dismissive, and defiant of the will of the people. A faceless bureaucracy operates in secret and weakens democratic rule. Media and academic institutions push flat-out assaults on our histories, traditions, and values. In the United States, my administration has made clear to social media companies that we will uphold the right of free speech. A free society cannot allow social media giants to silence the voices of the people, and a free people must never, ever be enlisted in the cause of silencing, coercing, canceling, or blacklisting their own neighbors. As we defend American values, we affirm the right of all people to live in dignity. For this reason, my administration is working with other nations to stop criminalizing of homosexuality, and we stand in solidarity with LGBTQ people who live in countries that punish, jail, or execute individuals based upon sexual orientation. We are also championing the role of women in our societies. Nations that empower women are much wealthier, safer, and much more politically stable. It is therefore vital not only to a nation's prosperity, but also is vital to its national security to pursue women's economic development. Guided by these principles, my administration launched the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiatives. The WGDP is the first ever government-wide approach to women's economic empowerment, working to ensure that women all over the planet have the legal right to own and inherit property, work in the same industries as men, travel freely, and access credit and institutions. Yesterday, I was also pleased to host leaders for a discussion about an ironclad American commitment protecting religious leaders and also protecting religious freedom. This fundamental right is under growing threat around the world. Hard to believe, but 80% of the world's population lives in countries where religious liberty is in significant danger or even completely outlawed. Americans will never fire or tire in our effort to defend and promote freedom of worship and religion. We want and support religious liberty for all. Americans will also never tire of defending innocent life. We are aware that many United Nations projects have attempted to assert a global right to taxpayer-funded abortion on demand, right up until the moment of delivery. Global bureaucrats have absolutely no business attacking the sovereignty of nations that wish to protect innocent life. Like many nations here today, we in America believe that every child, born and unborn, is a sacred gift from God. There is no circumstance under which the United States will allow international entities to trample on the rights of our citizens, including the right to self-defense. That is why this year I announced that we will never ratify the UN Arms Trade Treaty, which would threaten the liberties of law-abiding American citizens. The United States will always uphold our constitutional right to keep and bear arms. We will always uphold our Second Amendment. The core rights and values America defends today were inscribed in America's founding documents. Our nation's founders understood that there will always be those who believe they are entitled to wield power and control over others. Tyranny advances under many names and many theories, but it always comes down to the desire for domination. It protects not the interests of many, but the privilege of few. Our founders gave us a system designed to restrain this dangerous impulse. They chose to entrust American power to those most invested in the fate of our nation, a proud and fiercely independent people. The true good of a nation can only be pursued by those who love it, by citizens who are rooted in its history, who are nourished by its culture, committed to its values, attached to its people, and who know that its future is theirs to build or theirs to lose. Patriots see a nation and its destiny in ways no one else can. Liberty is only preserved, sovereignty is only secured, democracy is only sustained, greatness is only realized by the will and devotion of patriots. In their spirit is found the strength to resist oppression, the inspiration to forge legacy, the goodwill to seek friendship, and the bravery to reach for peace. Love of our nations makes the world better for all nations. So to all the leaders here today, join us in the most fulfilling mission a person could have, the most profound contribution anyone can make. Lift up your nations, cherish your culture, honor your histories, treasure your citizens, make your country strong and prosperous and righteous, honor the dignity of your people, and nothing will be outside of your reach. When our nations are greater, the future will be brighter, our people will be happier, and our partnerships will be stronger. With God's help, together we will cast off the enemies of liberty and overcome the oppressors of dignity. We will set new standards of living and reach new heights of human achievement. We will rediscover old truths, unravel old mysteries, and make thrilling new breakthroughs. And we will find more beautiful friendship and more harmony among nations than ever before. My fellow leaders, the path to peace and progress and freedom and justice and a better world for all humanity begins at home. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the nations of the world. And God bless America. Thank you very much.
You have been listening to President Trump deliver a notably subdued address to the United Nations General Assembly, a notably nationalistic address in which the president touted the U.S. as the most powerful country in the world, directly confronted China, talked about other key issues as it relates to international relations like Iran, like North Korea, the president making his case in front of this coalition of allies in some instances, adversaries in the other. Again, rather muted from President Trump here in what is a closely watched speech around the world. I want to bring in Kristen Welker, who's at the United Nations General Assembly, NBC's Carol Lee, MSNBC diplomacy contributor Ambassador Christopher Hill, former Assistant Secretary of State, MSNBC national security analyst Evelyn Farkas, Shibli Talami, senior fellow in the Sabin Center for Middle East Policy and former advisor to the U.S. missions to the United Nations, and MSNBC senior foreign affairs analyst Brett McGurk, former special presidential envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, some of the smartest analysts and leading contributors around the country. Kristen, let me briefly start with you and your takeaways from what we heard from the president and reaction in the room. It seemed from the reporting that there were some murmurs when the president talked about the U.S. as the most powerful country. He said the future does not belong to globalists, which appears to be an encapsulation of the president's philosophy moving forward as it relates to America first.
That's right. This was doubling, tripling down on his America First foreign policy. Some murmurs in the room when he talked about that. As you noted, Hallie, this was a pretty subdued speech. So the reaction from the audience was largely subdued as well, although worth noting that the Venezuelan delegation did have a reaction when the president called for other countries to get tougher on Venezuela. Among the top lines for me, certainly his comments on Iran, President Trump reiterating that the United States will not lift sanctions as long as Iran continues its malign behavior. The president accusing Iran of continuing to engage in wars, as well as continuing to essentially foment anti-Semitism. He said the United States is not going to tolerate it. Not altogether surprising. He talked about the fact that the U.S. just imposed new sanctions against Iran, but Hallie also said he was open to friendship, so really leaving the door open to diplomacy. Let me toss it back to you.
Kristen Welker, thank you. Carol Lee, it is, I think, fair to call this speech a languid one from President Trump, even as he delivered warnings very directly to some of the people that he wanted to deliver warnings to, including, by the way, migrants looking across the border. The president extremely directly telling them, do not come to the U.S.
Yeah, he was really aggressive about that. And if you look at the speech overall, he was very aggressive on the three things that are sort of most front and center for him in terms of his campaign, setting aside the Ukraine controversy, Iran, China and trade, and the migrant crisis. And
no
the
surprise
border.
that trade was his first point out of the gate here. And a direct confrontation with China sitting in the room.
He spent a lot of time on China, he spent a lot of time on Iran, he spent a lot of time on the border. And on China, he not only went after them on trade, but also on Hong Kong, which we haven't heard the president speak a ton about. And he basically said, he said, quote, we will say a great deal, how they respond will say a great deal about how China's role is in the world in the future. And he specifically called out President Xi. On
in
Iran,
language we haven't heard from him before.
Yeah, and on Iran, he talked a lot about what Iran has been doing and that they'll keep the sanctions on, but he offered no sense of how he was going to respond to the strike on Saudi Arabia's oil facility. So that's still a big open question.
Evelyn Farkas, you made the point broadly that this felt to you more like a State of the Union speech, frankly, than a UN General Assembly, given how nationalistic President Trump seemed here.
Right, Hallie, you've been reading my tweets. Yes, it sounded to me like a State of the Union address, which was completely inappropriate for this audience. Not the first time the president's done this, but that plus the America First, and he confused so many things. He doesn't know what a state is versus a nation. He says if you love your nation, you'll have peace. Actually, it's if you love your state, because nations can be ethnically divided, religiously defined. It's very different from what America is. So the message, I think, was really negative. It was either, just like a State of the Union, as I said, or just slamming everyone else and putting America first.
Ambassador Hill, I want to get to you and your reaction to what we've heard now, because as all of this is happening, of course, that shadow of Ukraine and that phone call with the Ukrainian leader back in July is still hanging over President Trump. Did he do a good enough job working to sort of change the subject here? Do you think his focus on issues like Iran is going to be effective with the allies that he wants to build a coalition with in the room?
No, I don't think he changed the dialogue at all. And frankly, the whole speech, and I like your use of the word languid, that's about how I would describe it. It was almost like one of these statements people have to read who are being captured by terrorists or something. He just kind of went through it. His eyes were almost weirdly closed as he did it, and I don't think he offered any kind of programmatic way forward. The litany against China included a lot of insults against China. That was not nice to see, and frankly, he seemed to equate Middle East terrorism with Iran. And frankly, as we know about Sunni terrorism, it's a far more complex issue than that. And then he went through a bunch of issues, some of which seemed to be, efforts by Ivanka to put stuff in the speech. So, first of all, I'm not even sure he read it before he read it before he actually delivered it. And secondly, I just don't think there's a lot to work there with. And I think the Chinese and others probably just looked at their calendar again and said, okay, 13 more months of this guy. So I really don't think it was a very good use of his time or, frankly, the UN General Assembly's.
Let me go to you, Shili Salami here, because the president also addressed issues that are of the utmost importance in the Middle East. He didn't talk much about his Mideast peace plan, which I think is notable, given that he's come under some fire for seeming to move away from that. But he did, as the ambassador has noted, and I know that you picked up on, discuss a lot about Iran, keeping the door open to potential diplomacy, but we know the president is not planning to meet and has said he's not planning to meet with the Iranian leader while he's here, although, again, he's not ruling that out either.
I think obviously he's given the speech at the UN, but it's really intended for the American people. That's the only way to read it. All the themes are really his campaign themes. The anti-globalism, the anti-socialism, the anti-bureaucracy, the anti-media, the anti-academics. But even on Iran, it's really an American audience because he has put himself on a slippery slope toward a war he doesn't want. And the American people don't want. In fact, I'm about to release a poll that shows over 75% of the American people, including a majority of Republicans, don't want war with Iran, even after the attack on the Saudi oil field, and shows also that he has higher disapproval ratings in his handling of Iran, including among Republicans after that attack. So you have a situation where he's sounding tough on Iran, but obviously holding an olive branch. And I think in the end, given that the Iranians understand him, they're trying to give him what he wants, which is something where he can best Obama, particularly on the nuclear deal, at the same time, a way to avert war. That's where the American public is. I think that's what we should expect in the coming weeks, despite of what he said.
To highlight that point, let me remind folks what the president had to say about Iran in the UN General Assembly speech we just listened to. Watch.
In response to Iran's recent attack on Saudi Arabian oil facilities, we just imposed the highest level of sanctions on Iran's central bank and sovereign wealth fund. As long as Iran's menacing behavior continues, sanctions will not be lifted.
Let me go to you on this. This is a region you know well, particularly the fight against terror in places like Afghanistan. The president addressed, as we expected, what he describes as his work with a coalition of Afghan partners here. But clearly, this is an issue that the president has had trouble getting his arms around so far in his presidency, not helped by those talks at Camp David that he had set up with the Taliban that were ultimately scrapped.
You know, Hallie, look, if I grade the president on a curve here, the speech was fine. I was at the last two UN General Assemblies. The first speech, he talked about a rocket man on the suicide mission, and we might have to totally destroy North Korea. Last year, he got laughed at by the chamber when he tried to say he was the most successful president. So this kind of had all the standards there.
So this is the bar that the president doesn't get laughed at the General Assembly?
Well, I think it is a pretty low bar. I mean, even this paradigm between globalism and patriotism is something he's used before. And I just have to tell you as a diplomat how that sounds to other countries. That's how Xi Jinping speaks about China. That's how Putin speaks about Russia. And little smaller countries ask us as diplomats, what is Trump talking about? Do we really want to unleash the forces of nationalism around the world, given where that can lead? But the truth is that our foreign policy is a bit of a mess. We have all these grand objectives with no real coherence about how we're going to achieve them. But Iran really is key, because I agree that we are on a trajectory for a conflict with Iran. I don't think Trump understands this. He thinks Iran is like North Korea. We can threaten them and they'll come back to the table. And that is not the course that he is on right now. He's in a real corner.
Evelyn Farkas, I have about 10 seconds left here, but I want to get to you because there have been some developments already related to the whistleblower complaint that is reportedly based on this phone call that President Trump had with the president of Ukraine. He is set to meet with the Ukrainian leader tomorrow. We understand that Joe Biden is likely to make some comments later this afternoon. That is coming in just as the president is giving his speech. How do you see this unfolding?
Yeah, I mean, really quickly, there's nothing to the Biden scandal. There's no Biden scandal. I was in the government at the time. It was our policy to get rid of that prosecutor general. It was international policy. I think the real issue is that the president tried to exert influence to get a foreign government to interfere in our elections again to help him personally.
I want to thank all of our analysts and guests who have joined us for this very busy hour here on MSNBC. It felt like about 4 of them, so I'm happy to turn it over to my colleague Craig Melvin. And Craig, listen, even as we're on the air watching the president's speech, you have more Democrats coming out saying, yes, impeachment inquiry, let's move forward with this. You have Joe Biden.
We do. 2 o'clock from Joe Biden. 7, as you know, 7 freshman Democrats writing that op-ed in the Washington Post. 2 of them are going to join me. 2 of the Democrats calling for impeachment. Hallie, thank you. Craig Melvin here, MSNBC headquarters, New York City. Under fire on the world stage, President Trump, as you saw, they're just wrapping up that speech at the United Nations, striking quite the nationalist chord, lashing out at Iran. All that coming as more headlines emerge about House correspondent Kristen Walker. Kristen, let's start with the president's speech here. Top lines, major takeaways from what we just heard from President Trump at the United Nations.
Well, Craig, I think one of the top lines does have to do with Iran. That's where we saw some of the president's sharpest language. The president, as you just heard there, saying that the United States is not going to lift sanctions against Iran unless it stops that behavior that the president really had harsh words for. Now, What did he have to say in terms of military action? Not a whole lot. President Trump really leaning into democracy, saying that we are still open to pursuing a path to friendship. I thought that was notable. He also had harsh words for China, not surprisingly, calling for a free and fair trade deal. The president indicating that they are not going to essentially make a deal until they feel as though they've gotten that. So reiterating a lot of what we've heard from China. You heard him talk about the UK. That was significant. The president indicating that they might be close to what he called a magnificent trade deal with the new prime minister there. Of course, he's going to be meeting with Boris Johnson a little bit later on today. I thought, taking a step back, Craig, what was very notable about this speech, he really underscored his America First foreign policy. We heard that reiterated at various moments throughout the speech. That sort of prompted at one moment some of those who were in the room to murmur. Clearly, that was their reaction and their response to President Trump saying that the United States is the strongest country, essentially, in the world. And you also heard some of his campaign lines. Some of the lines that we hear on the campaign trail, Craig, talking about immigration, really sort of using some of the language that he would use to rev up the crowds, but obviously a very different audience here at the United Nations as he speaks to the world stage. Equally significant, what he did not mention, Craig, climate change and this new controversy swirling around his phone call with the leader of Ukraine, as you pointed out overnight, mounting calls for impeachment from House Democrats. He did speak to that moments before he delivered this speech, but nothing about that during the speech. Not surprisingly, you can bet, though, Craig, he's going to get more tough questions about it throughout the day. Craig.
For folks who didn't see or hear the president before he went into the chamber there to give that speech, what did he say with regards to this controversy and the phone call to the president of Ukraine?
He said that the phone call was completely appropriate. He was pressed on reports overnight that he had ordered just 1 week before that call to suspend aid to Ukraine. He didn't deny those reports, Craig, instead simply saying that the aid was paid. Notably, he was also pressed directly on impeachment. Not surprisingly, he dismissed it. He called it all a witch hunt. And I want to just take a step back and note why that is so remarkable. This is the same language that we have heard now from 3 years from this president in talking about the Russia investigation last year when we were covering the United Nations. It was that probe that loomed large over that UN General Assembly. And now his contacts with a foreign leader coming under a microscope and intensifying scrutiny yet again, as President Trump says any calls for impeachment are ridiculous. But, Craig, as we've been reporting overnight, it feels as though the momentum has shifted. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi potentially reconsidering her opposition to impeachment as she is poised to hold a number of meetings on Capitol Hill today. Craig.
Kristen, welcome at the United Nations. Kristen, thank you. Let me go ahead and bring in Carol Leonnig, a Washington Post national investigative reporter. She's also an MSNBC contributor. Rick Stingel is with me, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, also an MSNBC political analyst. Joel Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Democratic strategist. Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, is also with me. Thank you all for being with me. And I'll start with you there, Mr. Haass. Based on what you just heard there in the room, President Trump addressing other world leaders, what were your major takeaways?
Well, the major takeaway is the president continues to outline a sense of national greatness as the key to American foreign policy, rather than articulating any vision of international cooperation, be it to deal with a challenge like Iran or North Korea, or to deal with a challenge like climate change. It's a century-old approach that's really ill-equipped for dealing with climate change and other challenges in a modern world. And then secondly, given the immediate issues for American foreign policy, I didn't expect them to go into Ukraine, but I was looking for something on Iran. And what's most interesting is what he didn't say. What we had was an emphasis on the flaws of Iran's leaders. There was no signal whatsoever that he would be open to any serious diplomacy, essentially say to build on or improve on the old nuclear agreement. So I actually think the most immediate takeaway from the speech is that Iran is sitting there watching and listening to it, They're saying there's nothing in it for us. So I think the chances of conflict between the United States and Iran have actually gone up slightly because they don't see any relief in sight from the sanctions. They don't see any diplomatic path. So what's left for them is to look for ways either to do a repeat of what they did against the Saudis or to continue to break out of the strictures of the 2015 nuclear deal.
And Rick,
In other words, what this gentleman just got through saying is, instead of Trump helping the situation pertaining to the Iranians, he's exacerbating it. He's making it worse because he's not opening up channels towards diplomacy to be able to work out some sort of a non-conflictable military clash with that particular country. Also, like what one of the commentators talked about pertaining to Donald Trump, never brought up anything about climate crisis pertaining to our environment changing as far as global warming. Did anybody really expect for him to talk about that? He is still asphyxiated towards thinking that these are some sort of imaginary ideals that not only the Americans are now seeing, but the rest of the world is seeing. And how come everybody else can see something that one particular person cannot? That literally speaks volumes about our president that is still in denial about global, planetarian, climate crisis changes that are happening all over this world, all over this planet. It speaks volumes. And I don't know if he's just trying to be cute. I don't know if he's really and truly that blind to the point that he cannot understand that these things are real, or if he's already done put himself in a squeeze corner to the point of damned if I do and damned if I don't scenario, and he's one of these that has so much pride towards wearing egg on his face, he's going to refuse it all the way to the end. In other words, he's going to ride this all the way out to the end, regardless of what it costs not only the American people in regard to his lunatic, immoral ideology in those regards, but his pride is standing in the way of reality. And the reality that a lot of people see, the way I understand it now, most people see, the reality is that if we don't do something in a severe, quick, crisis type way, we're not only jeopardizing our own existence upon this planet, but we're jeopardizing our children and our children's future towards them not being able to function as a civilized society towards understanding their accomplishments that we had the opportunity towards in our generation that now they're not going to have in theirs. And of course, whenever you see all these massive floods, all these massive fires, all these massive hurricanes, you have to understand that the King James Version Bible pertaining to God's only begotten Son, the words of read, not only in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but also in Revelations, corresponding with the things that are going to occur in a concurrent form in the book of Daniel. you have to be able to put the pieces together towards just exactly why was the creator of this universe working through his chosen, working through his begotten, working through Christ, Jesus Christ of Nazareth, giving out all these warnings to us. He was trying to help society and not hurt society. So I tend to wonder, whenever it comes to Donald Trump's mental capacity in the form of reality, of just exactly where his thinking truly may be. Let's listen to some more of the comments coming from various departments in these affairs. Thank you.
The future doesn't belong to globalists. It belongs to patriots. It was a line that stuck out to me. This is a president that has been making nationalist speeches since before he was president. Anything in that speech surprise you at all today?
Well, I suppose how domestic a speech it was. I mean, I think it was for a domestic audience, not the people in the hall. And to your point about nationalism, remember last year, President Macron of France said, there's a distinction and a difference between nationalism and patriotism. Patriotism is something that we can all embrace. Patriotism and globalism are not mutually exclusive. Nationalism, when Donald Trump uses it, is a dog whistle for dictators. It means anti-immigration. It means doing bilateral trade deals rather than international organizations. It is not a word that has a positive valence for all the people in that room, and I would argue it's a word used for his domestic audience.
It was a domestic speech. Joel, your reaction to what we...
In other words, what they're saying is that the speech did not fit the criteria of the audience that he was speaking to. And Trump is noted for doing stuff like this. And why he cannot understand the difference between speaking to a domestic audience versus speaking to an international, worldwide audience. Once more, you have to brush off onto the facts. We're looking at facts here. We're not looking at ideology here. We're looking at facts. You have to ask yourself a question. How come he is so out of touch with mainstream events that, yes, on foreign affairs affect our lives just as much as domestic affairs? How come he cannot figure out or materialize the difference towards what he needs to say during the time that he needs to say it? That's the part that gets to me. That's the part that gets to the people that's talking right now. That's the part that gets to the majority of the domestic audience over here. How come he is so fixated in a one lane thinking? In other words, to be a good president, sometimes you have to put on multiple hats. Sometimes you have to jump lanes. Sometimes you have to be a carpenter one day and the chief of police the next day, and one day you have to be I'll almost use the word internationalist, listening to the program, but one day you have to be I'm going to use this word versus an internationalist, more of a compromising approach in understanding that whenever you're dealing with other foreign affairs, there has to be a civil, intellectual approach up onto NAFTA, up onto dealing with foreign affairs, and that's the part that somehow or another Mr. Donald Trump don't get. For whatever reason, he don't get it. This was the time to build alliances, not to tear them down, Mr. Trump. This was your golden opportunity to build alliances across the pond in other parts of the world. Not slap them in the face and destroy them and disrespect them and shove innuendos down their throats. That's the part this guy don't get. And that's the part that I think a lot of people are looking at towards saying, wow, we are on not only a monetary self-destruction course, but we are on a social, international, devastating approach, especially whenever you have somebody that obviously don't care or isn't qualified to know the difference. Please listen.
We just heard from the president. How would you characterize it?
Yeah, Craig, he couldn't wait to get out of there. I mean, clearly there was no interest on his part in giving that speech. He was hugging the teleprompter.
He seemed a little low energy.
He had no energy. Yeah. No energy. In fact, Wilbur Ross was asleep in the audience too, and that's.
Was he really?
Yes, he was. And not a high bar there, but it was a schizophrenic speech, dissonant, whatever words you want to use to essentially say that the goals he's laying out are completely disconnected from the policies and the ideas that he's promoting and advocating. Iran, again, is a great example. I don't want a nuclear Iran, but I'm not going to lay out how to get there. We're going to continue to do more of the same, which of course is leading to a potential war with Iran. So a lot unsaid, dangerous, tiring, and clearly he wants to move on.
Carol, one could perhaps reasonably surmise that this is a president that does in fact have a lot on his mind. It's your reporting, and that could perhaps be top of mind right now. President Trump ordering his acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, to hold almost $400 million worth of military aid to Ukraine before supposedly asking the country to investigate former Vice President Joe Biden. Carol, is there any direct evidence that the president was using this money as a leverage to put pressure on Ukraine's president?
Well, our reporting indicates that the whistleblower's complaint relates to concerns that that's exactly what was happening. However, the one thing I would point to is something in our story where a U.S. lawmaker reports that in a September meeting with the Ukrainian president, Zelensky directly expressed to him concern that the lack of aid, forthcoming aid that Congress had authorized properly, the lack of aid was a quote-unquote consequence of him not agreeing to investigate the Bidens. Remember, the president basically says in the July 25th phone call with Zelensky multiple times, as we've reported and the Wall Street Journal before us reported multiple times, you gotta look into this. You gotta look into Biden and Biden's son. This investigation's important for looking at corruption. To a couple of weeks before that, the president also withholding aid and refusing to schedule a meeting with Zelensky, a public meeting, which is what Zelensky was seeking. It's just an odd set of coincidences, I guess, or an odd set of circumstances. Again, I would turn to Zelensky himself, the Ukraine president, who said this was his fear, that the two were connected.
And again, President Trump said to meet with the president of Ukraine tomorrow. Carol, likelihood, chance that this whistleblower at some point comes forward?
I think a lot of that is being worked out behind the scenes right now. The whistleblower has got to have reasons to be concerned legally about revealing anything that they're not supposed to under their employment agreement. So their career is on in the middle of all of this, a concern. It's got to be a concern. Then there's the possibility of retaliation and retribution. The president has already made plain, without ostensibly knowing who the whistleblower is, that the whistleblower is a partisan hack. So there's got to be fear about that. But I would think that much of this will be negotiated in coming days, and some elements of the whistleblower's complaint, the ones that don't leak out in the press first, are going to get to Congress.
President Trump commented about the pressure that's been put on the Ukraine. This is part of what the president said.
When you see the call, when you see the readout of the call, which I assume you'll see at some point, you'll understand. That call was perfect. It couldn't have been nicer, and even the Ukrainian government put out a statement that that was a perfect call. There was no pressure put on them whatsoever. But there was pressure put on with respect to Joe Biden. What Joe Biden did for his son, that's something they should be looking at.
So Joel, as phone calls go, according to the president, this was a perfect phone call. Not exactly sure how a phone call is perfect, but the president says it was a perfect phone call. His explanation surrounding the call has shifted a number of times already. How nervous should the president be?
He should be extremely nervous. And I'll give one tiny example here. The holding of the aid. I served in the State Department handling legislative affairs with the House. If we were going to hold money going to a foreign government, we would brief and explain and be clear as to why. They didn't give briefings that were clear. Members of Congress are coming out publicly saying, we didn't understand why they were holding the money. There's no clarity with this policy. What is clear is that there was a maneuvering to try to manipulate the Ukrainian government to do what the president wanted.
Rick, this is what the president said when he was asked about what Joel just mentioned there, when he was asked about withholding the aid. Here's one of his explanations.
There was no pressure put on them whatsoever. I put no pressure on them whatsoever. I could have. I think it would probably, possibly have been okay if I did, but I didn't.
So he said he didn't, but that it probably would have been okay if he did. This kind of back and forth, this kind of explanation, or these kinds of explanations, or lack thereof, how does it play on the world stage? Or do they play on the world stage? I mean, is this the kind of thing that leaders in other countries just look at us and they just shake their heads, or?
Well, it plays awfully, for one thing. But Craig, if Don Corleone asked you to look into something, does he have to say there's a quid pro quo for it? Does he have to actually threaten you with a particular response?
It's implied.
It's implied. He's the godfather. Trump is behaving exactly the same way. He's the president of the United States. He has $300 million worth of aid with Ukraine. The quid pro quo is implicit. And by the way, there doesn't even have to be an explicit quid pro quo. The president of the United States discussing with a foreign leader something that would benefit him domestically in a political campaign by itself is an impeachable event.
Richard Haas,
Did you hear what he said? The fact of the matter is, he just summed it up. Was and is an official, impeachable event. I don't know what was said. Others don't know what was said. A lot of times it's not what you say, but it's the intent of what you was wanting to get out of what you was saying that means a whole lot. And I'm sure after that is studied by a panel, they will come to their own conclusion of whether or not this was inappropriate, unethical behavior upon to the President of the United States' behalf in trying to do this. Once more, let's not deviate from the facts. The fact is, this was a golden opportunity for our president to build alliances rather than tear them down. The fact of the matter is, Donald Trump does not think that environmental changes all over this planet pertaining to global warming is something that is dire, though it has costed trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars and millions of lives affecting these type of events in some sort of way or another, either directly or indirectly, pertaining to the forces at bay acting abstract, unusual, different, unbalanced. We're seeing things up in Alaska and up towards the icebergs in Greenland and up in other parts of the planet that is just absolutely mind-blowing. Scientists all over the world are blowing whistles and raising red flags. But we have a president that don't think it's real. And he thinks, because he thinks that way, that we're supposed to think that way. Now, is that not a form of socialism pertaining to dictating to people in the way that they not only hear what's coming out of one particular individual's mouth, but how that they are supposed to respond? It kind of puts you in the same category towards what Hitler actually done. Hitler, as well as other dictators all over the world, use this same type of tactic against those who are opposing them, towards not just dismembering from them, but in a lot of cases having them assassinated. Naturally, Donald Trump can't do that because of our laws here in America. Thank God. But could you only imagine if Donald Trump actually had the free reins of being a leader, let's say in Venezuela or some other third world country? He would probably, I can't say this for sure because he hasn't been there and done it, but looking at the things that he puts out and how his approach is, he would probably be just as rootless as they are towards the needs of the greedy outweighs the needs of the needy. That's how that I believe that he would make a stance in other communist control socialism countries. Now that's my opinion, and it didn't cost you nothing. It did not cost you nothing for me to make that statement about Donald Trump. And there's no doubt Donald Trump has brought a lot of good things to the forefront pertaining to illegal immigration, pertaining to the drug problem, pertaining to other issues that has occurred in regard of the past 3 or 4 other administrations surrounding NAFTA and surrounding international affairs. So the whole thing is a mess. And it becomes complex to be able to wrap your mind around it, to be able to understand, well, is this guy going to be part of the problem, or is this guy going to be part of the solution to the problem? Well, as of right now, from the looks of things and from the hearing of things, it looks like the guy is turning out to be more of the problem than he is the solution to the problem. Once more, this is my opinion, and I have a right to my opinion, and I do believe I have a right on my social platform, as long as it is not threatening, to be able to voice my opinion in that regard. And I'm sure that there will be many others that will see it on the same stage as I do. Let's fulfill this and listen to the ending parts of these comments.
You are more plugged in than most with our allies, perhaps even some of our adversaries. How is this playing out so far?
Well, it's still relatively new, and people want to see how it does play out here, what, if any, implications it has politically. I think what it does is highlight for every other government how difficult it is to deal with this president and this administration. This is unlike any of his predecessors. The fact that a conversation would take place like this, the fact that aid would be held up, presumably or allegedly, for domestic political purposes, puts everybody else in an awkward position. Take the government of Ukraine. They clearly don't want to alienate this president. They wanted the aid released. They want American support against Russia, which continues to wage a war in Ukraine's east, continues to occupy Crimea. On the other hand, they don't want to get mixed up in American politics. They don't want to get crosswise with Democrats. So the question is, how do you deal with the president's request at the same time you try to protect and preserve a relationship with the United States? It puts leaders in an impossible, awkward box, which is one of the reasons we're seeing the kind of conflicting messages we're seeing out of government officials in Ukraine.
Joel, you were at the State Department under Barack Obama. If President Obama had engaged in this kind of behavior, if what's being reported is true, and at this point there's no reason to believe that it's not, what would the reaction have been?
Well, I remember what it was on a fake scandal, the Benghazi scandal, 3 years, congressional hearings, a crisis turned into a political punching bag. And this isn't just unpresidential, it's un-American. What the president has done is he has decided that the government belongs to him, not to the American people, that it's his toy to play with. He can use it as he wants for his own personal gain. It's his own piggy bank.
Exactly.
It's unpresidential. Barack Obama didn't even come close, and if he had, he probably would have been impeached by the Republicans.
What I find most striking about this story,
he would have been booed off the stage.
Rick, is that reportedly the phone call was made the day after Robert Mueller testifies. It really is eye-popping on so many levels. Thank you so much. It's so nice to have you both here in the flesh. Richard Haas, thanks to you as well.
I want to weigh in on one other thing that did not get talked about pertaining to our national indebtedness. You know, how can you reason with a bunch of foreign diplomats that we have reached a level here in America to the point that we're going to have to reasonably, logically reverse the clock in regard towards starting it all over again if we're ever going to have a future for our children and our children's children pertaining to not just this nation, one of the greatest nations on the planet, but how are we going to reverse the damage that's already done if we do not default in these regards? He never brought that up. Once more, whenever you're dealing with an international audience like this, as the old saying goes, you strike the iron while the iron's hot. Why did he not bring up other solutions to the American problems on this international front? You have to ask yourself the $64,000 question. Is this guy for us or against us? Is he doing what he is doing ignorantly, or is he doing what he's doing intentionally? Or slash quote question, is he even qualified? Does he even have the capability of understanding the peril that is causing so much trouble here in America? And it is causing trouble. It's causing morale problems all over towards children looking at the future and saying, no way, this thing is doomed. And if the system's doomed, that means we're doomed. And that's what's coming out of the mouths of these millennials, because that is their way of thinking. They're saying, wow, is this all that this government has to offer is a video game? Or to sit down and watch a movie that's been orchestrated by Hollywood? Is this it? They're asking, is this it? Is this all we have to look forward to? That's the reason why the drug culture was so exacerbated in the past 20, 30 years. That's the reason why the increase of the gun violence and the suicides in one form or another. Because whenever you break the system, whenever you break the bank, per se, as us being right under $23 trillion in debt, it is nerve-wracking to those that live not in la la land, but live in reality towards thinking, my God, once I do finally get old enough to retire, is there even going to be a retirement? You know, whenever they first started talking that talk 25 or 30 years ago, and we was only, let's say, 1 trillion or 2.3 trillion or $4 trillion, it was questionable towards even putting forth the energy of that ideal. But whenever you're over 20 trillion, almost 23 trillion, now it's more realistic to think that way towards my God. Why even pursue this dream of happiness of one day we're going to be able to live out our remaining lives in the golden era, the rocking chair per se era, if there is so much doubt that hangs over our heads of realistically never having it to look forward to begin with. Everything's all out of balance. It's all out of focus. And I realize that Donald Trump did not create all of this. And this did not develop just overnight, because a travesty has been committed here in America. But because the travesty has been committed, let's try to work towards the solution to the problems, and let's not add to the problems by creating more problems. In other words, let's not exacerbate this thing, and let's try to all get our heads wrapped around it and try to figure out some sort of a diplomacy in satisfying not just the American international interest, but the whole world's interest. That's the part that these men have just got to elaborating on and expressing their feelings about. Because whenever you are dealing with such idiotic behavior that we're seeing on a grand scale, you have to ask the simple question. And I'm not talking about the question such as which come first, the chicken or the egg. No. I'm talking about the question of the survival of the planet. The survival of the future of this planet, regardless whether it's economical or environmentally. What is the future? What does the future hold? Looking through the crystal ball per se, looking at the tea leaves. Okay? What does the future hold towards not only the American citizens, but what does the future hold for all the millennials that are now getting old enough to understand these failed policies, these evil, demonic, cruel, greedy, selfish people that was wanting to put their interest above the interest of others, that has shoved society off in this type of dilemma. Thanks again for listening to the Windmill Ministries program here at 291 Thompson Road, Sharon, Tennessee, zip code 38255, pertaining to the broken cross that surrounds the lives of many that have been broken, shattered, damaged, and some even at the point of total annihilation in regard to a future and the broken system that we're now dealing with of not only one nation, but the healing of all nations. Please pray for our existence, but more importantly, pray for the existence of our children and our children's children towards making the right decisions in these regards. Good luck to all of us as we pursue our endeavors. Going, I repeat, going, traveling, exploring into the future where no one has gone before. Thanks again. God bless. And God bless the United Nations as well as the United States of America.